Hello, everybody. Professor Barth here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to the sixth and final part of our section on Thomas Hobbes, itself part of a larger series on the foundations of Western political thought. Excuse the professional dress. I was teaching a class today at ASU. We're going to conclude our section on Hobbes today, Resisting Leviathan. It's actually a two-part lecture. The first part will look into Hobbes's ideas on the best form of government, and then we'll look at the subject of resistance, rebellion. Is it ever acceptable? We'll see what Hobbes has to say. Of course, if you haven't watched part one, the introduction, you're going to want to do so. I also did 2 history lectures. Check those out. And then part 4, we looked at Hobbes on the state of nature and on natural right and natural law. And then part 5, we looked at the social contract or covenant of every man with every man, which institutes the Commonwealth, wherein the sovereign bears the person of the people, who are, in effect, the author of all that the sovereign does. To recap Hobbes's chain of argumentation here, men have a natural right in a state of nature. Men have a right to do anything within their power to preserve their own life. Now, the first law of nature is that each man must do everything within his power to preserve his life. But in the state of nature, because it's a war of all against all, owing to this right that all men have in a state of nature, no man is secure in his possession. No man is secure. Life is nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. Therefore, reason dictates that men seek peace in order to preserve their own lives. If that's not possible, you make war, according to that law of nature. But you ought to seek peace. And the second law of nature, Hobbes continues, is that men be willing to contrive articles of peace when others are also willing, resulting in a mutual renouncing or transferring of right. This creates the Commonwealth when men mutually covenant, every man with every man, to transfer right over to a sovereign power, whether a single man or an assembly of men, doesn't matter. And then this sovereign power bears their person and thus unites their wills into one unitary will. Each person in the Commonwealth, therefore, has made himself author of whatsoever actions the sovereign performs and must, therefore, submit to the sovereign's will and judgment. The third law of nature, according to Hobbes, men must abide by the covenant made. Once that covenant has been made, it cannot be broken. To break the covenant would be unjust because it would return civil society back to the war of all against all. And ninthly, the sovereign possesses exclusive power to establish civil laws and to compel all subjects to honor the covenant made. This is also true in democracies or in representative assemblies. There remains a sovereign in such polities, and that sovereign still has the exclusive power to establish civil laws. Even you may vote for that sovereign, but once elected, that sovereign has exclusive power to establish civil laws and to compel all subjects to honor the covenant made. We're going to take a look at resistance and rebellion today. But first, let's remind ourselves why the sovereign exists. The sovereign exists for this end or for this goal. According to Hobbes, the safety of the people. The safety of the people. In fact, according to Hobbes, he is obliged by the law of nature to work toward that end. Interesting. Fairly liberal account of government. The safety of the people is the end the goal of the sovereign, and he has an obligation, a duty. He is obliged by the law of nature to work toward that end, and he will be held to account. But he will render an account to God, the author of that law, and to none but him. The subjects are not to hold the sovereign to account. But this is the obligation of the sovereign, the safety of the people, and he has a fairly broad, robust definition for safety. He says, by safety here, quote, is not meant a bare preservation, but also all other contentments of life, which every man by lawful industry, without danger or hurt to the Commonwealth, shall acquire to himself. The good of the sovereign and people cannot be separated. They're inextricably linked. Quote, it is a weak sovereign that has weak subjects, and a weak people whose sovereign wanteth or lacks power to rule them at his will. So they both need one another. A strong sovereign needs prosperous subjects, happy, content subjects. In like manner, such a people need a powerful, robust sovereign who is able to rule, to act as sovereign. And so the good of sovereign people cannot be separated. Now, what is the best form of government? Hobbes spends some time on this in Leviathan. It's actually quite interesting. I would skip over this, but I think there's maybe some interesting topics of conversation that you all can discuss below in the comments. First of all, he says, there is no perfect form of government. Don't fall for the siren song of utopianism. There's no such place as utopia. You're never going to find it. Different systems have different strengths and weaknesses. Now, the sovereignty can be in one man, or it can be in an assembly of more than one man. When the sovereignty is in one man, it's called a monarchy. When it's an assembly of all, it's a democracy, demos. And when it's in an assembly of a part only, it's called an aristocracy, where the assembly only represents what is deemed the best part of society. They that are discontented under monarchy, Hobbes says, call it tyranny. They that are displeased with aristocracy call it oligarchy. They which find themselves grieved under a democracy call it anarchy, which signifies want of government. Hobbes' preference is monarchy, and he gives the reasons why monarchy is the best form of sovereignty. Not a perfect form of sovereignty, but the best. In monarchy, Hobbes says, the private interest is the same with the public. The riches, power, and honor of a monarch arise only from the riches, strength, and reputation of his subjects. For no king can be rich, nor glorious, nor secure, whose subjects are either poor or contemptible, or too weak through want or dissension to maintain a war against their enemies. Stated in so many words, the monarch has skin in the game. The monarch understands that if his subjects are not thriving, he is not a strong monarch. She is not a strong monarch. Queen Elizabeth understood that. Queen Elizabeth I, and perhaps Queen Elizabeth II. But Queen Elizabeth I, who was monarch when Hobbes was a young child, understood if you don't have thriving subjects, if you don't have a thriving kingdom, then how much glory do you have as a monarch? Now, history would disagree on a number of occasions, perhaps with this generalization. However, as a generalization, it's an interesting one because Hobbes juxtaposes monarchy, in this case, skin in the game, to democracy or to aristocracy, but especially democracy, where he says in a democracy, the public prosperity confers not so much to the private fortune of one that is corrupt or ambitious, as doth many times a perfidious advice, a treacherous action, or a civil war. In a democracy, Hobbes argues, you're more likely to have ambitious politicians who want to have more and more power. The king already has power. Okay, the king's already sovereign. Okay, but in a democracy, you get these types who want power, and you get corrupt types who want to make money. Private interest in that corruption, that ambition their interests are more likely to align with something that's different from the public interest. They're more likely to pursue perfidious advice, treacherous action, or even a civil war, which of course is a nod to Parliament's action leading up to the Civil War in England in 1642. Secondly, Hobbes says, a monarch receives counsel of whom, when, and where he pleaseth, and consequently may hear the opinion of men versed in the matter about which he deliberates, of what rank or quality soever, and as long before the time of action, and with as much secrecy as he will. When the sovereignty is located in one man, he's more likely to be a bit more discerning than a corrupt assembly. When a sovereign assembly has need of counsel, Hobbes continues, none are admitted but those who have been versed more in the acquisition of wealth than of knowledge, because in a democratic assembly, this is what truly matters, more than knowledge, the acquisition of wealth, and are to give their advice in long discourses, which may and do commonly excite men to action, but not govern them in it. For the understanding is by the flame of the passions never enlightened, but dazzled. So, in short, in an assembly, especially a democratic assembly, they are more prone to listen to the advice of those who are able to inflame the passions, who are able to dazzle. And that a democratic assembly is more likely to fall into this trap than a monarch. Again, you can look at the history of it, and it's not that clear cut. Hobbes here is dealing with generalizations. And of course, the fact that there's a multitude of assemblymen makes it a lot less likely that such counsel can be taken with confidentiality. Thirdly, Hobbes continues, the resolutions of a monarch are subject to no other inconstancy than that of human nature. Okay? Now, human nature can be quite depraved, so you get depraved monarchs, but the monarch is subject to no other inconstancy than that of human nature. But in assemblies, besides that of nature, there ariseth an inconstancy from the number. So you're dealing with two problems with an assembly. Human nature, which a monarch also deals with, but then also the fact that there's a multitude in the assembly, and you'll have different opinions, and so there's not the unity that you would find in a monarch. Fourthly, a monarch cannot disagree with himself out of envy or interest, but an assembly may, and that to such a height as may produce a civil war, as it did in England in 1642. A democratic assembly or an aristocratical assembly is prone to faction, to infighting, to rivalry that you don't find in the institution of monarchy. Now, Hobbes says this, in monarchy, there is this inconvenience, that any subject, by the power of one man, for the enriching of a favorite or flatterer, may be deprived of all he possesseth, which I confess is a great and inevitable inconvenience. Monarchs can be and have been historically easily flattered, and certain treacherous counselors, certain counselors who don't have the public interest at mind, have perfected the art of flattery, and the monarch is especially prone to this. Why? Because the monarch is especially concerned about his or her own glory, which is why, in theory, the monarch's interest should align with the public interest. Because again, if you want glory as a monarch, the people should be in a state of prosperity and thriving. But the flatterer can easily trick the monarch. That's a great and interesting, he had this place this word here, inevitable inconvenience. But the same may as well happen where the sovereign power is in an assembly. For their power is the same, and they are as subject to evil counselors, or to evil counsel, and to be seduced by orders, as a monarch by flatterers. So the monarch is seduced by a flatterer. The assembly is seduced by orators, again, who inflame the passions. It's a different seduction, but both lead to bad advice that harm the public. But this is really interesting. Seduced by orators and in an assembly, becoming one another's flatterers, serve one another's covetousness and ambitions by turns. In an assembly, even a factious assembly with all sorts of different rivalries and political parties, they essentially flatter themselves. They serve one another, not the public. They look out for their own interests. It's sort of like an insider club. They serve one another's covetousness and ambition. And so in some ways, this is worse than the monarch being seduced by the flatterer. Boy, you look at the United States Congress, and doesn't this describe the U.S. Congress? Not just today, but going back a long time. They've become one another's flatterers and serve one another's covetousness and ambition by turns. They look out for one another's interests. It's a bipartisan game in Congress, isn't it? And whereas the favorites of a monarch are few, and they have none else to advance but their own kindred, the favorites of an assembly are many. There's all sorts of lobbyists, right? Coming in and out of Washington. They are many, because there are many people to lobby. And so the favorites of an assembly are many, and the kindred much more numerous than of any monarch. The sovereign power, whether placed in one man as a monarchy or an assembly of men, as in popular or aristocratical commonwealths, is as great as possibly men can be imagined to make it. So he says, okay, no matter what form of government, the sovereignty must be absolute. It must be great. And though of so unlimited a power, men may fancy many evil consequences, you may say, wow, that's dangerous to have an absolute sovereign. In whatever form, monarchy, democracy, aristocracy, that's dangerous. It says, men may fancy many evil consequences coming from so unlimited a power, yet the consequences of the want of it, the lack of it, is perpetual war of every man against his neighbor. And that consequence is much worse, Hobbes says. Comment below if you agree or disagree with that reasoning. The condition of man in this life shall never be without inconveniences. Again, you're not going to find utopia on earth. Those who promise utopia, run in the other direction. But there happeneth in no commonwealth any great inconvenience but what proceeds from the subject's disobedience and breach of those covenants from which the commonwealth had its being. And here we have the transition now to resistance and rebellion, because Hobbes sees this as the great inconvenience in any commonwealth, no matter what form. Disobedience from the subjects and breach of that original covenant that gave birth to the artificial man, that gave birth to the commonwealth itself. So, can Leviathan ever be lawfully resisted? Hobbes says there's this third law of nature. We looked at this last time. The third law of nature is that men perform their covenants made. Why is this a law? Why is this such a big deal that men perform their covenants made? Well, without this, covenants are in vain. They're just empty words. And the right of all men to all things remaining, we are still in a condition of war. If you can just break the covenant like that, no consequences, then you return to that state of war. And so, men are obliged, bound to not make void that voluntary act of their own, that was the creation of that Commonwealth through that covenant. You must not break that covenant. Covenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all. What is a covenant if you can just break it? It's worth no more than a piece of paper it was written on. It's just words. And then no man has security. You return back to the state of nature. Being thereby bound by covenant to own the actions and judgments of one, they, that is the people, cannot lawfully make a new covenant amongst themselves to be obedient to any other in anything whatsoever without the sovereign's permission. I use the analogy of the marriage covenant. My wife and I, if we get in an argument, can't just throw up your hands and say, well, I'm out. I'm going to make a new marriage covenant with somebody else. Now, of course, with the laws of the United States today, with no-fault divorce, you legally can. But according to natural law, according to God's moral law, you cannot. That covenant cannot be dissolved. And in the same way, this covenant of every man with every man, which created the sovereign, which transferred right to the sovereign, cannot be undone. Well, why is Hobbes so staunch on this? Well, again, he's covenants without the sword. It's just words. But he elaborates a little more here. If there are any subjects who pretend or who claim a breach of the covenant made by the sovereign at his institution, if you have a group of subjects that say, "Hey, look, the sovereign here, we had something else in mind, and we don't like what he's doing. And you've broken the covenant, sovereign, and we're going to completely dissolve this covenant and make a new covenant with somebody else." If you have subjects who claim a breach, but then there are others, even if it's just one other of his subjects or himself alone, the sovereign alone, pretend there was no such breach. Now you have a disagreement, don't you? You have one group of people saying there was a breach of the covenant by the sovereign, and so now it's dissolved. But then you have another group that says, no, there was no such breach. This man or assembly of men is still our sovereign. We still owe him allegiance. Now there's this disagreement. And in this case, there's no judge to decide the controversy. Who decides who's right? There's no judge to decide the controversy. And so what happens? It returns, therefore, to the sword again, which is exactly why you made the covenant in the first place, to quit the state of nature. This is why you transferred right to begin with. And now you're returning back to that state of nature. It returns to the sword. And every man recovers the right of protecting himself by his own strength, contrary to the design they had in the institution. So once you open this door, this possibility of claiming that the head of state has broken the covenant and now it's dissolved, you open yourself up to perpetual civil wars, conflict, strife, because you're always going to find some people who are discontent. There's always going to be someone who's discontented with the form of government. And then there's always going to be people who maintain their allegiance to that government. Who judges? Who decides the controversy? It just returns to the sword. Well, you say, well, at that original covenant, what if I, the subject, had dissented? What if I didn't agree with this original covenant to begin with? Well, Hobbes says, because the majority of people by their consenting voices declared a sovereign. He that dissented must now consent with the rest. Okay, even if at the original covenant you dissented, or like let's say it's a few generations later and you weren't even at that original covenant, and you look at things and you dissent. Well, tough. You still must consent with the rest. That is, be contented to avow all the actions he, the sovereign, shall do, or else justly be destroyed by the rest. If you refuse to consent to this Commonwealth and refuse your obedience to this sovereign, which bears the person of the Commonwealth and to whom people had transferred right, if you dissent from that, you may justly be destroyed by the sovereign through the means of the sovereigns, through the sword, or by the rest. Every subject is by this institution author of all the actions and judgment of the sovereign instituted. By this institution of a commonwealth, every particular man is author of all the sovereign doth. And consequently, he that complaineth of injury from his sovereign complaineth of that whereof he himself is author, and therefore ought not to accuse any man but himself. An interesting argument. What do you make of that? You complaining about your government? Well, you're author of this system. You say, I didn't author this system. Well, you're part of the Commonwealth. You're part of this greater covenant. And the sovereign bears not just your person, but bears the person of all the people who live within that Commonwealth. And so you yourself are the author. And you must submit to the actions and judgments of that sovereign as your own actions and judgments as author. And because the end of this institution, or the goal of this institution, is the peace and defense of them all, and whosoever has right to the end has right to the means, it belongeth of right to whatsoever man or assembly that hath the sovereignty to be judge both of the means of peace and defense. The sovereign alone is judge of the proper means to that end, which is the peace and defense of them all. It is the sovereign alone who is judge of the proper means. It is the sovereign alone who determines what is necessary to be done for the preserving of peace and security. And it's your duty as subject to submit to those decisions. However, Hobbes provides an exception. What's the exception? Like, wow, Hobbes is quite the the absolutist here. I mean, do I have to, according to Hobbes, must I submit to everything, like literally everything that the sovereign does? Hobbes says, well, not exactly. Not exactly. Not all rights are alienable. That word alienable, you're familiar with the Declaration of Independence about inalienable rights. What is an inalienable right? Well, the Declaration recognizes those inalienable rights to be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those rights are inalienable, meaning that no person can transfer those rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Locke would say life, liberty, and property. No person has the power or ability to transfer those rights from themselves to somebody else or to the sovereign. And Hobbes agrees that there is an inalienable right. Not all rights are alienable, Hobbes says. There be some rights which no man can be understood by any words or other signs to have abandoned or transferred. Well, what is this right that no man can be understood to have abandoned or transferred? It's the right to life. A man cannot lay down the right of resisting them that assault him by force or take away his life. That's the exception. You retain this right to preserve your own individual life. That right is not alienable. It's an inalienable right that cannot be transferred to another. It cannot be understood that in joining this Commonwealth, in making this covenant, every man with every man, that you somehow transferred the right to defend your own literal life. If a monarch or an assembly of men, through the power of the military or police force, attempts to take your life, you are not bound, according to Hobbes, to just lay down and say, oh well, I'll take Hobbes' advice and just submit. Go ahead, kill me. Hobbes would not say that. Hobbes would say, no, you have retained that right to resist. In that case, you may resist. The same may be said of wounds and chains and imprisonment. So Hobbes even extends it a little more. If the government attempts to not just kill you, not simply kill you, but wound you or put you in chains or imprison you, you have not renounced your right to resist by joining this, by belonging to this Commonwealth. You still retain that right to resist, because a man cannot tell, Hobbes says, when he seeth men proceed against him by violence, whether they intend his death or not. Interesting. It's quite an exception there, that you have a natural right, that an inalienable right, Hobbes says, to resist any member of the state who comes against you by violence. Moreover, if the sovereign commands a man, even if you are justly condemned in a court of law, to kill, wound, or maim himself, or not to resist those that assault him, or to abstain from the use of food, air, medicine, or any other thing without which he cannot live, yet hath that man the liberty to disobey. The government, even if you did something that deserved capital punishment, if the sovereign commands you to take your own life, you can't do that. You have the liberty to disobey that command. If the sovereign commands you to abstain from the necessaries of life, like food, water, you have the liberty to disobey. You retain that right. No man is bound by the words themselves, that is, of the covenant, either to kill himself or any other man. So interestingly, this out that Hobbes provides is, once you examine it a little more closely, actually, it gives license to perhaps more rebellion than one might think at the outset. For example, what if a dictator like a Stalin or Hitler type figure commands you to kill not yourself but other people? According to Hobbes, you are not bound. No man is bound either to kill himself or any other man. You have liberty, in other words, to disobey. Is it rebellion? Yes, but it's based on this natural, inalienable right. When our refusal to obey frustrates the end or goal for which the sovereignty was ordained, then there's no liberty to refuse. Okay, if your refusal to submit to government undermines the government's effort to secure safety, the preservation of the people, you have no right or liberty to refuse. Otherwise, there is. Wait a second. Otherwise, you have a liberty to refuse to obey the sovereign? If the sovereign, if your refusal to obey doesn't, what if your refusal to obey doesn't frustrate the end for which the sovereignty was ordained? Let's remind ourselves, earlier, Hobbes said that the end, the goal of the sovereign power is the safety of the people, not simply a bare preservation, but all other contentments of life. What if a tyrant endeavors through a, to quote Locke, long train of abuses to waste and destroy the people? That certainly does not go along with the end of the sovereign power. That's not the goal of the sovereign power, obviously, to waste and destroy the people. So is there a liberty to disobey? Hobbes ends this section at this sentence. Otherwise there is, and then it's just period, and he moves on to another topic. Interesting. You wish Hobbes would elaborate a little more. Now, we can infer based on Hobbes's earlier statements about how, well, who's to be the judge in such controversy? One man could say this has become a tyranny and this tyrant is wasting and destroying the people, whereas a whole other group of people say, no way, this is a benevolent monarch or assembly, and they're doing what's right for the people. Now who's to be judge in that controversy? You go back to the sword. So maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I can't help here but see some sort of out. In fact, I might go so far as to say that there's a subversive element here in Hobbes, that perhaps he's not even telling us everything that is going on in his own mind. Perhaps Hobbes is a little more open to resistance against tyranny than what most people have given him credit for. That's my inclination. I could be wrong on that. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Seems like Hobbes is giving us some sort of avenue here for resisting tyranny. Now Locke will overtly open up that path to resistance. I mean, he'll our next figure in this series is going to be Locke. This is our final video in the series, so I'll start Locke in a couple months. Locke is open about it. Hobbes downplays it, but discerning eyes can certainly perceive some sort of avenue here to resisting tyranny, perhaps. Now, what if the sovereign flees the country or is conquered in war? What then? Must we still submit to this sovereign who has fled, who is now in exile? I'm thinking here's the son of the executed King Charles I, future King Charles II, fled to France, lived in France and in Holland for the entirety of the 1650s. Is he still the rightful sovereign? No, he is not. The obligation of subjects to the sovereign, Hobbes says, is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. Charles is no longer able to satisfy the ends of government. And so you are obviously he is no longer able to satisfy them. He's in a completely different country. He's in exile. He is no longer the sovereign of that land. And so you have no obligation at that point. For the right men have by nature to protect themselves when none else can protect them, can by no covenant be relinquished. So the sovereign gets out of town, Okay. The people have a right to protect themselves, to contrive articles of peace. So the sovereign has left. We'll have a new covenant. We'll have a new covenant. In the case of England, so it's acquisition or sovereignty by acquisition, where the victor was able to impose sovereignty. The sovereignty is the soul of the Commonwealth, which, once departed from the body, the members do no more receive their motion from it. Once the sovereign departs, you are no longer obliged to submit to said sovereign. Under this reading, Charles, while he was in exile, was a pretender. He was a pretend sovereign, not an actual sovereign. Now, Charles, while he was in exile from 1649 to the early part of 1660, he claimed to be king. In fact, when he becomes king proper in 1660, Charles claimed to be in the 11th year of his reign. But it wasn't the 11th year of his reign. It was the first year of his reign, in actuality. Once that sovereign departs, the body no longer receives its motion from it. And so that covenant has now dissolved. This takes me to the last portion, and what I've termed the Hobbesian Paradox. A paradox meaning an apparent contradiction that's can be difficult to account for. And this paradox has to do with this idea of sovereignty by acquisition, which I detailed in the last video, Lecture 5. Sovereignty by acquisition. Now, sovereignty by acquisition is when the sovereign power is acquired by force, through war, through civil war, or conquest. The victor acquires sovereignty as soon as the defeated party acknowledges the victor as sovereign and gives the victor their full obedience, their full allegiance. They do so out of fear, not of one another, but out of fear of the victor. That distinguishes sovereignty by acquisition from sovereignty by institution. Nonetheless, such a sovereign, though acquired by force, such a sovereign possesses the same, indeed identical, prerogative rights as any other sovereign and is equally legitimate. So, where's the paradox? Well, let's consider this. Hobbes makes it very, very clear throughout Leviathan. It is unlawful and unjust to resist or rebel against a sovereign. It is certainly unlawful to wage war against one's own sovereign. Therefore, clearly, if a rebel group aims to depose a sovereign by force, they are acting unjustly and illegitimately. However, if the rebel party wins that contest and the defeated side submits to the rebel victor, that rebel has now acquired sovereignty and is now the rightful and legitimate sovereign. And all people who haven't fled into exile, if you remain in that land, all people owe this new sovereign their unconditional obedience and submission. This once rebel is now legitimate. Once illegitimate is now sovereign. Do you see the apparent contradiction here? This is strange. But they were acting unjustly and illegitimately. Now they are the legitimate sovereign. Again, you see why Hobbes's book was so detested by the exiled royalists in France. This is an apology for Cromwell's government. And here's the problem for Hobbes. this would seem to incentivize rebellion against the sovereign. I mean, Hobbes can say all he wants that it's unlawful or illegitimate. But if it's baked into your theory that, however illegitimate that rebellion and that war, that if you succeed, you become not just sovereign, but rightful and legitimate. You see the problem there? Now, I think Hobbes, if Hobbes were here to defend himself, would simply say, look, I'm just describing reality. The reality is, I didn't like this rebellion. I didn't support it. It was illegitimate. It was unlawful. It was unjust. But it was done. And so now this is the legitimate sovereign. And that's just a fact of the matter. It's probably how Hobbes would defend himself. I mean, Hobbes, all throughout the 1630s and throughout the 1640s, during the course of the war, acknowledged King Charles I to be the rightful sovereign. The Roundheads and Cromwell's New Model Army were acting unjustly. Their rebellion against the king was illegitimate. But they won. They succeeded. They decapitated the king. And by 1651, the war was over. And Cromwell, along with the Rump Parliament and the Council of State, was now, according to Hobbes, the rightful, legitimate sovereign. And Hobbes comes to England in 1651 in large measure to flee Paris, where royalists were so angered by this exact argument in his book. And Hobbes acknowledged Cromwell as the rightful and legitimate sovereign. Cromwell dies in 1658. Not long after, the Parliament voluntarily transfers sovereignty over to King Charles II. Hobbes, without any inconsistency at all, acknowledges King Charles II to be the rightful, legitimate sovereign of England. Charles said he was in the 11th year of his reign in 1660. Hobbes didn't publicly disagree with him, but privately he would have thought to himself, "No, Your Majesty, you are in the first year of your reign, but you are rightful and legitimate." So that concludes our lecture series on Thomas Hobbes. In a couple months, I don't have an exact date yet. We'll see how I feel. We'll look at John Locke. John Locke, that'll be a good one. A lot to talk about there. Very, very different thinker from Hobbes, of course. But there's also some overlap. So, in the meantime, I'll check in with some dollar reports and so on. Thanks for watching this series. If you haven't watched the section on Thucydides or Machiavelli, be sure to do that. I think you'll enjoy them. See you next time. Bye.